In the late 1920s, when America still believed in limitless ascent and reputations could be sculpted as carefully as the facades of fashionable summer estates, Joseph Patrick Kennedy arrived at Cape Cod with an idea that was larger than any individual ambition. He wasn't simply looking for a house. He was searching for a stage on which an entirely new American lineage could stand. The coastal air of Hyannis Port carried the quiet confidence of old New England families, people whose influence was inherited, not acquired, and who rarely welcomed newcomers into their carefully guarded circle. Yet this was exactly why Kennedy chose this place. If he could plant his family here among the old names, their children would grow up speaking the language of belonging long before anyone questioned how they learned it. The property he purchased in 1928 seemed, at first glance, modest compared to the grand estates scattered across Massachusetts' coastline. 3 houses clustered on 6 acres of windswept land, connected by lawns that sloped gently toward the water. White clapboard siding, dark shutters, porches oriented to catch the afternoon sun. Nothing ostentatious, nothing loud, nothing that would betray the fact that the man signing the deed had made his fortune through methods that invited quiet speculation. That was the brilliance of it. The houses looked as though they had stood there for generations, absorbing storms and summers alike, blending seamlessly into the landscape of families who had been part of Cape Cod society since colonial times. Kennedy understood that the architecture of legitimacy required subtlety. A newcomer who tried too hard to impress would be dismissed. But a newcomer who appeared as though he had always been part of the scenery, who simply arrived and existed with the calm assurance of someone returning to his rightful place, might eventually be accepted, or at least tolerated. Hyannis Port, with its weathered shingled roofs and understated elegance, offered exactly the kind of environment where a rising family could craft the image of long-established roots. More importantly, the property held strategic potential. Its arrangement was not random. The larger central house would serve as the command post for family life, and the 2 neighboring homes would eventually shelter the next generation. In Kennedy's mind, geography was governance. If his sons lived steps from one another as adults, their lives would remain intertwined, their ambitions aligned, their collective influence amplified. Cape Cod would not merely be a summer destination, it would become the gravitational center of the entire family. The land itself seemed to promise durability. The Atlantic stretched out like a vast frontier at the edge of their lawn, an ever-changing landscape that reminded visitors of both possibility and peril. The sea was a physical expression of the challenge Kennedy intended to give his children: adapt, compete, endure, and the family would do so under his watchful eye, within the boundaries of a place that felt timeless. It was no coincidence that the property's porches faced the open water. They were positioned like balconies overlooking the stage of the family's future, as if waiting for the performances that would one day unfold. Even before the furniture arrived, Kennedy could already picture the rhythmic pulse of life that would fill the compound. Children racing across the grass, heated conversations spilling from the dining room windows, politicians and businessmen stepping onto the veranda with cocktails in hand, trying to understand how this Irish Catholic outsider had inserted himself so seamlessly into their world. But the most important audience for this production was the children themselves. They would grow up surrounded by the subtle signals of old money privilege: salt-bleached fences, crisp sailboats rocking gently at the dock, neighbors who taught their children to speak softly but with absolute certainty. By placing his family here, Kennedy was doing more than establishing a residence. He was engineering an identity. The neighbors watched with polite distance as the family settled in. Some whispered about the newcomer's background. Others questioned whether a man with such a restless reputation truly belonged in their quiet coastal enclave. Yet the houses themselves softened the resistance. Their traditional lines, their modest scale, their lack of ostentation, they all suggested continuity rather than intrusion. It became easier, even necessary, for locals to treat the Kennedys as though they were simply another part of the Cape Cod landscape. Another family escaping the summer heat of Boston, another cluster of children laughing by the water's edge. The architecture served as diplomacy. Within the first weeks of living there, the home began shaping family rituals. The lawn in front of the main house became a natural arena where competition forged personalities and rivalries alike. The The long wooden dock provided a launch point into cold Atlantic waters, where strength and grit were tested daily. Inside, the rooms were arranged not merely to accommodate 11 people, but to encourage a certain type of family culture, one where voices collided, where opinions had to be defended, where being overshadowed meant being forgotten. The house was not simply shelter, it was instruction. And yet, beneath this carefully constructed domestic stage, something deeper was emerging. Hyannis Port was not just a retreat, it was a claim. By choosing this place, Kennedy announced, without saying a word, that he intended his family to stand among the country's most influential. The house allowed him to perform modesty while cultivating power. It made ambition appear natural, almost inherited. When he first stepped onto the porch and looked across the water, he wasn't admiring the view. He was imagining a legacy. The decision to buy those 3 houses became the first real cornerstone of that legacy. Every corridor, every porch beam, every window facing the sea would soon bear witness to great triumphs and equally profound moments of loss. But in 1928, the compound existed only as promise. The rooms were ready to be filled, the lawns ready to be marked by footsteps, the shoreline ready to echo with laughter and arguments that would define an era. It was a kingdom in its earliest form, quiet, unassuming, and destined to become one of the most symbolically charged properties in American history. The 3 houses in Hyannis Port did not simply sit beside one another as separate dwellings. They operated together like a single organism, arranged with a precision that revealed what Joseph Kennedy expected from his family's future. The largest structure at the center, with its broad porches and long dining room, acted as the heart of the compound. It was the place where decisions were made, where energy concentrated, where voices overlapped in rooms that always felt slightly too small for so many strong personalities. Everything important began there and spread outward. On either side, the 2 smaller houses formed a kind of extended spine, positioned so closely that no member of the family could ever disappear into isolation. Each building was close enough to feel the pulse of the others, the physical distance narrow enough that privacy became optional and community unavoidable. This proximity shaped the rhythm of life from the very first summers. With 9 children moving constantly across the property, the houses funneled them into shared spaces, hallways that filled quickly, staircases that required negotiation, rooms that demanded presence rather than retreat. It was impossible to pull away without someone noticing. That lack of escape created an atmosphere where competing, asserting oneself, and refusing to be overshadowed became part of survival. The compound did not tolerate passivity. Its architecture nudged everyone toward participation, argument, and ambition. Even the placement of windows, facing both inward toward the lawn and outward toward the sea, encouraged the sense of being both observed and challenged, as though the environment itself asked the children whether they were prepared to match the expectations set before them. The lawn between the houses, shaped by years of coastal wind, functioned as the family's informal arena. Here, boundaries faded. The nearest porch might be used as a sideline, the opposite house as a goal marker, the waterfront as the finishing line for races that seemed to erupt daily. The open space acted as a training ground where no one was allowed to soften. Older children set the tone, younger ones pushed themselves until they found their place. And Joseph watched from the porch with a gaze that measured effort as much as results. The compound made rivalry feel natural, like part of the weather, something carried on the wind from house to house. Inside, the design of the main residence amplified this environment. Bedrooms were arranged to minimize isolation. Children shared spaces even when the rooms were technically large enough for separation, creating constant contact and unavoidable comparison. The dining room stretched long enough to seat everyone, but its narrow shape pulled voices together, forcing rapid exchanges that treated hesitation as weakness. Anyone unprepared to keep up quickly learned the cost of falling behind. The house rewarded quick thinking and penalized uncertainty, becoming not only a family center, but also a classroom in which lessons were delivered through conversation rather than lectures. The smaller houses extended this dynamic into adolescence. As the older brothers grew, they drifted into these nearby buildings, but even then they remained within arm's reach of the main house. Their windows faced the central lawn, making them visible even when they attempted independence. The compound seemed designed to remind every resident that ambition was communal, Success belonged not to the individual, but to the entire family project. No one could detach from that structure, not physically, not emotionally. The property's layout resisted detachment and encouraged alignment. At the same time, those same architectural choices began to reveal the first fractures. The tight placement of rooms and the constant closeness that had once felt energizing started to expose the differences between the children. Some thrived in the noise and pressure. Others found themselves struggling with expectations embedded into the very walls. Those who couldn't keep the pace felt it most intensely inside the compound, where there was nowhere to hide from comparison. The house brought out strength, but it also exposed vulnerability. The dock extending into Nantucket Sound reinforced the competitive rhythm from another angle. Each tide filled the harbor with opportunities for skill, risk, and improvement. The children launched boats, navigated currents, and raced with a seriousness that mirrored the atmosphere inside the houses. The dock became an outdoor classroom, teaching resilience, strategy, and fearlessness. Yet the water also carried a quietness the houses lacked. On calm days, reflection spread across the surface, hinting at feelings unspoken inside the compound. But even that quiet was temporary. The shouts from the lawn, the organized chaos from the porches, and the relentless drive of the family quickly pulled everyone back into the shared pulse of the property. Over time, the three houses evolved from simple coastal residences into a mechanism of influence, conditioning, and identity. Their placement, design, and daily use molded the family's character in ways no school or institution could. They produced confidence, sharpened instincts, and cultivated determination. But they also introduced strains that would deepen with every passing year. The compound's power lay not in luxury or grandeur, but in the way it structured ambition. It held its residents close, pushed them forward, and reminded them constantly that they were part of something larger than themselves, something that demanded excellence, unity, and relentless momentum. And as the children grew into adolescence and then young adults, the houses continued to shape them, preparing the compound for its next transformation. A place that would need to balance its role as a training ground with its emerging role as a symbol of belonging in the wider world. Hyannis Port quickly became more than a private refuge. It turned into a display window seen by neighbors, summer visitors, and the closely knit network of old New England families who watched every newcomer with a mixture of curiosity and guarded skepticism. The compound's outward appearance played a decisive role in shaping those first impressions. Unlike the grand mansions that lined parts of Cape Cod, the Kennedy houses projected a quiet, traditional charm. Weathered shingles, modest porches, soft colors that blended into the coastal landscape. This restraint signaled familiarity, as if the family had always been part of the Cape's seasonal rhythm. People passing by could easily imagine that these homes had belonged to multiple generations, rather than to a man who had only recently forced his way into their social world. Yet the neighbors sensed something unusual from the start. The activity level around the property was different from the slow-moving routines typical of long-established families. There was a constant pulse, children running across the lawn at full speed, voices rising from morning until evening, boats cutting across the harbor more aggressively than the usual leisurely sailing. The energy had an edge to it, a competitiveness that set the compound apart from nearby homes, where families spent summers strolling quietly, playing cards in screened porches, and maintaining a rhythm that emphasized calm rather than intensity. People noticed that the Kennedy household did not simply inhabit the space, they filled it. Local newspapers occasionally referenced the family, first with cautious interest, and later with an awareness that something significant was forming behind those high hedges. The press found the combination of coastal normalcy and political ambition fascinating. Articles often described the children's sailing abilities, their academic accomplishments, or their striking presence on the beach. But behind the gentle tone of these stories, there was an undercurrent of wondering who exactly this new family was and how long they intended to remain. Hyannis Port was a place where lineage mattered. A family that arrived fully formed and highly visible disrupted the expected social order. Inside the compound, though, the atmosphere contrasted sharply with the measured simplicity the exterior suggested. Within those walls, every day operated like a rehearsal for future prominence. Conversations at the dinner table grew heated over politics, world events, and literature. Even casual remarks turned into debates. A visitor might see only a large family gathering for a meal, but beneath that surface, the children were learning how to defend positions, hold attention, and resist being overshadowed by siblings who were just as determined to make themselves heard. The contrast extended to every corner of the property. From the outside, the dock appeared to be a modest family accessory, the kind found at countless coastal homes. Yet the races launched from that dock, the skill-building exercises performed on those waters, were far from leisurely pastimes. The children treated the ocean like an extension of the training ground, measuring themselves against changing tides and unpredictable winds. While neighbors viewed their own boats as tools for quiet afternoons, the Kennedys saw theirs as instruments for mastering technique, speed, and control. Visitors who stepped onto the property often felt caught between these two worlds. The porches invited conversation, the gardens suggested calm, and the interior decoration leaned toward traditional taste. But beneath the welcoming veneer was a pace that outsiders struggled to match. Guests sensed the pressure that flowed through the family's interactions, an invisible current just strong enough to leave an impression. The compound taught its residents that rest was temporary, that improvement was constant, and that being seen by neighbors, by newspapers, by anyone, meant always performing a version of success. With each passing season, the compound's reputation grew. Some neighbors began treating the family with admiration, impressed by their discipline and the achievements of the older children. Others remained cautious, sensing that the Kennedys were not merely summer residents, but people shaping a broader narrative that extended far beyond the edge of Cape Cod. The houses themselves encouraged this dual interpretation, elegant on the outside, restless on the inside. This tension between appearance and reality became the defining feature of Hyannis Port's early years. The property projected the calm of old New England tradition while nurturing a world built on ambition, rivalry, and relentless expectation. As the family became more visible beyond Massachusetts, the compound transformed into a symbol that outsiders viewed with fascination, unaware that its walls held both the polish of public success and the weight of private demands. That split identity, half serene facade, half pressure-filled engine, marked the beginning of the estate's double life, a duality that would only intensify as the family's influence expanded and the compound drew ever more attention from beyond the Cape. As the compound settled into its role as both home and symbol, a quieter transformation began inside its walls, one that visitors rarely sensed and neighbors never fully understood. The same closeness that fueled competition also exposed every imperfection, and the house gradually developed ways of absorbing whatever did not fit the polished image the family projected to the outside world. With each passing year, Hyannis Port started to behave almost like a living entity, rearranging itself around discomfort, creating pockets of silence where certain stories faded from view. The corridors that once echoed with footsteps and arguments began revealing another layer of the estate's character. Doors that had always remained open during the children's earliest years slowly started to close, not out of routine, but out of necessity. Rooms that once held vibrant energy became still, their windows shuttered more often, their interiors tidied in ways that felt less like maintenance and more like preservation. The house learned to conceal, to soften the edges of anything that might disrupt the impression of unbroken promise. The shift was most noticeable around the spaces once occupied by those who struggled to meet the unspoken expectations woven into the compound's design. In a household where achievement was the default language, the quieter children, those who needed more time, more patience, more understanding, found themselves subtly displaced by the pace of life around them. Hallways that had once felt communal began to develop shadows at their ends, places where someone could slip out of the constant comparisons, though never far enough to be free from them. One of the bedrooms near the back of the main house captured this change more clearly than any other. Once filled with laughter and shared games, it gradually became a room where time felt suspended. The space remained furnished, the curtains neatly tied back, the decorations carefully preserved, but the liveliness faded. It wasn't abandonment, it was a kind of quiet reorganization, as if the house had gently pulled someone out of the spotlight and into a softer, more protected corner. The room stayed intact, as though waiting for a return that no one truly expected. Other parts of the compound adapted similarly. A narrow stairwell near the kitchen grew noticeably quiet. A study that had once hosted bustling evening reading sessions shifted into a space where voices dropped automatically, as if acknowledging that something fragile lingered there. Even the lawn, normally a territory of fierce competition, developed an invisible boundary around certain spots where memories outweighed activity. The overall effect was subtle but unmistakable. The estate was learning to hide its own uncertainties. The adults sensed the change too, though none of them spoke openly about it. Rose moved through the house with her usual poise, but her route shifted slightly, avoiding particular corners with practiced grace. Joseph, who preferred direct confrontation in most parts of life, treated the quieter rooms with a surprising restraint, as if the spaces themselves had requested discretion. Their choices reinforced the silence, giving the house permission to continue dividing itself into public and private zones. The children, however, understood the transformation more instinctively. They noticed when a sibling stopped appearing in certain games. They recognized when a door that had once stood open was kept closed for longer stretches. They sensed when someone's presence grew softer, their participation thinner, their role in the compound recast into something more distant. The house didn't push anyone away, it simply stopped pulling them forward, and in a family built on constant forward motion, that difference felt immense. Soon, the estate began carrying these quiet stories in the same way it carried memories of laughter and triumph, through objects left untouched, routines that shifted, and hallways that held echoes no one wanted to revisit. The compound maintained its outward shine, greeting guests with the familiar blend of cheer and discipline that defined the Kennedy image. But behind that polished surface, entire sections of the house became repositories for unspoken emotions, holding them gently behind closed doors. Hyannis Port evolved into a place where victories were celebrated in the open, while uncertainties were absorbed into the architecture itself. The estate did not erase anyone. It preserved them in quiet pockets that only the family understood. The rooms remained, unchanged and waiting, serving as both comfort and reminder. The more the outside world praised the family's accomplishments, the more the house relied on these invisible spaces to carry the weight of everything that didn't fit the perfect picture. By the time the compound entered its next era, this dual nature had become part of its identity. It was no longer just the birthplace of ambition. It was the keeper of secrets, a place where silence settled gently over certain rooms, while the rest of the property continued its relentless, confident rhythm. The moment the family expanded their presence to Palm Beach, the entire architecture of their identity shifted. Where Hyannis Port offered salt air, wind-worn shingles, and the understated dignity of New England restraint, the new estate in Florida radiated an entirely different language. Arched windows, warm stucco walls, carved stone details, palms leaning over the property like guardians of a far more theatrical world. It was a winter palace in every sense, a place where the family's ambitions could stretch beyond the limitations of regional tradition and into the realm of polished national visibility. The house stood along North Ocean Boulevard, a street already shaped by families whose wealth predated the century. It was an address that carried weight, a place where influence was cultivated quietly behind gated entrances and tropical gardens. Unlike the Cape, where even the wealthiest homes flirted with simplicity, Palm Beach welcomed display. Here, elegance was expected, and Joe Kennedy used that expectation to his advantage. The property allowed him to inhabit a different social ecosystem, one where conversations were more global, where business and politics intertwined more openly, and where the climate itself encouraged a slower, more deliberate form of networking. The Mediterranean-style structure communicated exactly what he needed it to: refinement without desperation, confidence without excess. Its wide terraces and symmetrical proportions made an immediate impression on visitors, projecting authority without relying on the modest charm that defined the Cape Cod compound. The house stood calmly, as though it had always been part of this sun-soaked world, waiting for someone to claim it with purpose. In doing so, it offered the family a new kind of legitimacy, one built not on blending in, but on occupying space among the country's most established elites. The two estates served different functions, almost like two halves of the same instrument. Hyannis Port encouraged physical resilience, internal rivalry, and the discipline that came from a place where weather changed rapidly and the sea demanded caution. It was the environment of training, a landscape that toughened the children and shaped their approach to competition. Palm Beach, meanwhile, offered visibility, not the public attention of press cameras, but the quieter noticing of influential families who controlled financial networks and political pathways. The compound in Florida was not a battleground. It was a salon, a space designed for conversations that shaped opportunity. For the children, the transition between these worlds created a rhythm that defined their upbringing. Summers on the Cape taught them to endure cold water, unpredictable winds, and the constant push to outperform one another. Winters in Florida taught them how to walk into a room with grace, how to converse with diplomats, investors, and social figures with the confidence of people born into that orbit. Each environment sharpened a different part of their upbringing, making them adaptable to situations that ordinary families never encountered. The contrast between the estates was not only environmental, but emotional. Hyannis Port, despite its expectations, held the familiarity of routine, the same lawn, the same dock, the same tight-knit activity. Palm Beach introduced more structure and more distance. The rooms there were larger, the ceilings higher, and the atmosphere more formal. Here, children moved a little more quietly. Aware that their father often used the estate for meetings, he preferred to keep away from Boston and New York eyes. The sound of conversations behind closed doors carried differently in this house, echoing along the tiled floors and through hallways designed for adults rather than for the chaos of 9 siblings. The social scene in Palm Beach brought its own challenges. Families who had weathered decades of national influence watched the Kennedys with curiosity. They recognized determination when they saw it, and the Florida estate gave them a closer look at a family whose trajectory was rising. The Kennedys, in turn, absorbed lessons from their new surroundings, how to move through formal events, how to present themselves with effortless poise, and how to use charm as effectively as ambition. These were skills that Hyannis Port alone could not teach. Yet beneath all the sophistication, the estate served a deeper purpose. It allowed the family to control the narrative of who they were becoming. If Hyannis Port represented roots, Palm Beach represented reach. One house told a story of heritage and work ethic. The other told a story of polish and connection. Together, they created an image so complete that few questioned the distance between how the family lived privately and how they appeared publicly. By the late 1930s, the existence of 2 such dramatically different homes had become essential to the family's identity. The Cape was where their resilience grew. Florida was where their influence expanded. The northern house shaped their character, while the southern house shaped their reputation. Each location carried its own energy, its own expectations, its own version of the truth. The dynasty did not rely on a single foundation. It relied on both, operating in harmony. 2 climates, 2 social worlds, 2 architectural languages, all revolving around a family determined to rise. The houses became masks the family could switch between, depending on what the moment required, the appearance of humble tradition or the impression of cultivated sophistication. Together, the estates formed a dual portrait that would define the family for decades, sending them into the next chapter of their story with a level of preparation that few families could match, and with a pair of homes that reflected both their strength and the pressures beginning to gather beneath the surface. The family soon learned that living between Hyannis Port and Palm Beach meant more than simply changing climate twice a year. It created a dual rhythm, a constant shifting between 2 contrasting worlds, each designed to shape different parts of their identity. The move from one house to the other was never just seasonal. It was psychological, emotional, and deeply formative. The northern estate pushed the children to develop resilience. The southern estate taught them how to inhabit power. Both were essential, and yet the movement between them carried a cost that grew more visible with each passing year. In Hyannis Port, the days began with brisk mornings, salty wind, and the expectation that every child would prove themselves through motion, running across the lawn, sailing against a stronger sibling, keeping pace at the dinner table. The compound expected effort, rewarded quick thinking, and demanded presence. Here, the children were shaped by unpredictability, sudden storms, cold water, competitive games that could turn intense without warning. The house raised them to be fighters, to earn admiration not by birthright, but but by performance. Palm Beach, however, moved at an entirely different tempo. The light fell differently across its tiled floors, casting long shadows in hallways that invited measured steps rather than hurried ones. There, the children learned how to behave among ambassadors, financiers, and families whose influence stretched across industries and continents. The estate was warmer, still, and meticulously structured. Conversations were polished, social etiquette was essential, and the presence of their father in frequent meetings taught them that power was not only won, it was maintained through charm, alliances, and appearances. The expectations were less physical, but no less demanding. For the children, shifting between these two environments created a feeling of living parallel lives. In one, they had to prove their toughness. In the other, they had to prove their refinement. In Hyannis Port, loud voices and energetic competition were normal. In Palm Beach, they were toned down, reshaped into polite conversation that masked the same ambition beneath a smoother surface. Each house expected something different, and mastering both became an unspoken requirement of growing up a Kennedy. The constant travel reinforced the sense that home was not a single place, but a cycle. Just when someone began to settle into the rhythm of the Cape, winter arrived and the family relocated. As soon as they adapted to the rituals of Palm Beach, the formal dinners, the quieter routines, the school year yanked them back north. Each transition felt slightly destabilizing, as though the children were always catching up to the version of themselves expected in the next location. They learned early how to adjust quickly, to switch from energetic sibling rivalries to elegant dinner table conversation without hesitation. Yet the houses themselves remembered what the family tried to ignore. The walls in Hyannis Port carried the sharp edges of arguments and competitions that some children could not match. The polished floors of Palm Beach echoed footsteps that often slowed near the closed study doors, where their father handled business they were not meant to hear. The spaces absorbed traces of discomfort, moments when a child's confidence wavered, when exhaustion showed, when the strain of living two contrasting lives began to tug at their sense of belonging. These traces accumulated invisibly. In Hyannis Port, laughter lingered on the lawn, but so did the memory of someone leaving a game early because they felt overwhelmed. Palm Beach held similar imprints, moments when one of the children struggled to fit into the high expectations of adult social circles. Though unspoken, these small emotional losses had weight. The houses, with their distinct demands, shaped each child differently, and not all adapted easily. The adults rarely acknowledged the tension between the two estates, but the children felt it deeply. Hyannis Port pushed them, Palm Beach polished them. Together, the estates created a powerful foundation for the family's public rise. But in the quiet spaces between those transitions, on train rides, in crowded cars, in the silence after formal dinners, the children sometimes wondered who they were outside of these two roles. Neither house made space for hesitation. Both required performance, and both held memories that revealed how challenging that performance could be. As the family grew more visible nationally, the dual life of the two estates became more pronounced. Hyannis Port shaped their character. Palm Beach shaped their image. Both were essential to the strategy Joseph Kennedy had envisioned, and both began recording the earliest signs of the pressure that would eventually follow the family into every chapter of their lives. The 1940s changed the atmosphere of the Kennedy homes more profoundly than any earlier decade. The estates that once pulsed with motion, laughter, and constant activity began absorbing a new kind of silence, one that arrived suddenly, carried in the form of telegrams delivered to the doorstep, with the weight of news no family wished to receive. Hyannis Port, once the emblem of endurance and competitive spirit, shifted into something quieter and heavier, as though the walls themselves understood that the family's bright trajectory had been pierced. The telegrams never came expected. They arrived under clear skies, on calm afternoons, during moments when the compound looked almost peaceful. A messenger climbing the steps of the main house meant a disruption so severe that even the children sensed it before a word was spoken. The crisp paper, the official language, the stunned silence that followed, these moments became imprinted onto the estate in ways no one could undo. Hyannis Port, which had trained the family to push through any challenge, could not soften the shock that settled over the rooms after each message. Joe Jr.'s space became the clearest marker of this shift. His room in the main house, once filled with tokens of competition and reminders of plans laid out for him since childhood, remained untouched after the news of his loss reached the family. The bed stayed neatly made, the books on his desk kept in order, the small personal items left exactly where he had placed them before leaving for service. The room no longer functioned as a living space. It became a preserved snapshot of a life that was meant to continue but did not. Family members passed it quietly, never closing the door fully, though no one entered without purpose. The house seemed to understand that something had been removed from it permanently. Other areas of the compound adapted to this new emotional weight as well. The lawn, once a stage for constant competition, grew quieter. Games ended sooner. Some were not started at all. The dock, where the children had launched boats with the reckless confidence of youth, felt subdued. Sailboats returned to their moorings more slowly, as if the water itself reflected the family's shift from exuberance to introspection. Even the evenings grew more still. Conversations that once filled the dining room now softened, replaced by long pauses and glances that carried more emotion than words could. Palm Beach absorbed its own share of silence. The Winter Palace, with its elegant design and warm light, became a place where the family gathered not for celebration, but for processing the weight of the decade. The high ceilings amplified quiet moments, and the tiled floors carried footsteps that moved slower, more thoughtfully. The house that had once showcased polish and confidence now held evenings where the adults sat together for hours without speaking, each carrying private reflections that the children were too young to fully understand. The children felt these changes deeply. They noticed the empty chairs, the lowered voices, the way their parents' expressions shifted when someone mentioned the war. The houses that had once seemed invulnerable now felt permeable, vulnerable to news from thousands of miles away. The stability the compounds were built to project no longer felt unbreakable, and the younger siblings saw this fragility in ways they lacked the language to express. Hyannis Port, especially, began to feel like a quiet monument. When the family gathered there, the energy that once filled every inch of the property seemed muted, as though the estate was holding its breath. The house had always pushed its residents to be strong, but now it served a different purpose, one that acknowledged the need for stillness, for collective reflection, for honoring spaces that had suddenly become symbolic. The compound was no longer just a training ground. It had become a place where absence was felt in every corner. The war had changed the world beyond the Kennedy homes, but inside the estates, the transformation was deeply personal. Rooms that once celebrated ambition now carried memories. Hallways echoed with softer footsteps. The family gathered more tightly, but with a gravity that had never existed before. The houses, steady and immovable, became repositories for the emotions the family could not always express aloud, holding those feelings quietly until time pushed the story forward into its next era. As the 1940s faded into the following decade, the Kennedy homes began to change not through renovation or expansion, but through absence. The two estates, once vibrant with overlapping conversations, physical competition, and the confident rhythm of a growing dynasty, began to feel stretched by memories rather than by the presence of the people who once filled them. The houses remained structurally unchanged, yet something shifted in the way they were experienced. The energy that once pushed outward now seemed to pull inward, and the architecture itself began carrying a weight that residents felt the moment they stepped inside. Palm Beach, which had once functioned as the family's polished winter court, gradually lost some of its purpose. The rooms designed for formal gatherings and elegant dinners went unused for longer stretches. The polished floors, once warmed by steady foot traffic, reflected light in emptier patterns. The tropical gardens remained manicured, but fewer footsteps crossed the pathways that connected them. The estate still held its graceful posture, yet behind its beauty lingered a stillness that suggested the family no longer needed the same kind of social performance that had once been its mission. The silence in Palm Beach developed slowly, spreading room by room. A sitting area, once used for evening conversations with visiting friends, remained untouched for entire seasons. The long dining table that had hosted diplomats and business associates now saw fewer place settings. Even the grand staircase, normally a central artery of movement, grew quieter as the family visited less frequently. The house was not abandoned. It simply began to hold more echoes than voices, as though it understood that the family's center of gravity had shifted northward. Hyannis Port absorbed the weight differently. Here, the stillness carried more emotion because the Cape House was built on decades of deeply personal memories. Every room held remnants of past seasons, but now those remnants pressed more heavily on the family members who returned. The once unified rhythm of footsteps across the wooden floors became fragmented. Someone might walk through the front door and pause, sensing the absence before noticing anything else. The perceptions were subtle at first. A hallway that felt longer, a porch that seemed quieter, a stairway that no longer echoed with the same overlapping patterns of movement. The lawn, once shaped by constant activity, changed tone as well. Even when the family gathered, the laughter didn't carry as far, and the breaks between conversations stretched slightly longer than before. Games were still played, but with fewer participants, and the pauses between them felt more pronounced. The dock, which had once launched an endless stream of boats, now often sat empty in the late afternoons, the water brushing quietly against its wooden beams. Certain rooms in Hyannis Port became difficult to enter. Joe Jr.'s preserved space remained the most visible symbol of absence, but other rooms began adopting similar qualities, spaces that once held full lives, now containing only traces, a desk left in order but rarely opened, a closet with clothes that no longer moved with the seasons, a guest room that hosted fewer visitors. Small details accumulated, forming a quiet mosaic of remembered presences. The architecture of the compound intensified these feelings. Long hallways framed by doors on either side carried echoes of what the house had once been. The family could walk through them and almost feel the ghosts of former routines, children running toward the kitchen, siblings debating loudly in the stairwell, voices rising from the porch as the day's energy spilled outward. Now, those same hallways amplified the lack of movement. The air seemed heavier, as though it carried the stories the walls refused to release. Palm Beach, meanwhile, began to feel like a house waiting for a family that never stayed long enough to reclaim it. Each return reminded them how much had changed. The furniture looked the same, the sunlight cast familiar patterns across the floor, but the emotional anchor of the estate had loosened. What had once been a stage for diplomatic networking and polished appearances now felt almost ceremonial, a beautiful space wrapped in a thin layer of detachment. In both homes, time seemed to settle differently than before. The spaces no longer followed the calendar of planned accomplishments and structured routines. Instead, they marked the quieter milestones, the years since someone last sailed from the dock, the months since a certain room had been used, the day a family member noticed that their footsteps felt louder than they once had. Together, Hyannis Port and Palm Beach began to reflect, not the confident future the family had envisioned, but the emotional truth of what had been lost along the way. The walls carried an awareness that the family was still moving forward, yet no longer in the same formation. The houses, once engines of ambition, now held layers of memory that pressed gently but persistently on those who remained. Every corridor became a reminder, every porch a reflection, every quiet room a whisper from the past. The estates had not stopped being homes, but they had become something else too, structures that preserved the shadows of absent voices, absorbing the family's losses into their foundations long before the next chapter of their story began. Hyannis Port began to shift again as the post-war years unfolded, waking from its quiet period with a new kind of momentum. The house that had once been defined by childhood competitions and later marked by the silence of loss started filling with voices that carried a different purpose. The compound, still shaped by memory, began absorbing a new rhythm, one defined not by family routines, but by political strategy. What had once been a training ground was transforming into a command center, and the shift could be felt in every corner of the estate. The change started subtly. A few advisors arrived for afternoon meetings, carrying folders filled with early plans. Then came the typewriters, brought into rooms that had previously held summer books and board games, and their clattering rhythm became part of the daily soundtrack. Telephones multiplied throughout the house, their ringing interrupting meals, conversations on the porch, and quiet evening moments that had become rare. Gradually, the compound took on the energy of an expanding operation, as though preparing for a role it had always been destined to play. The siblings felt the transformation immediately. The lawn, once reserved for races and impromptu games, now hosted clusters of strategists gathered around folding tables, sketching campaign routes on large maps weighed down by stones against the coastal wind. Photographers circled the property, framing shots of the family on the porch or by the water, images that would later become part of a national narrative. The once private corners of the compound grew busier, each space repurposed to support the growing political engine taking shape. Inside the main house, the dining room transformed first. The long table that had hosted family debates became the unofficial headquarters for morning briefings. Piles of memos and reports replaced the usual summer clutter. Voices overlapped in rapid exchanges, creating an intensity reminiscent of the children's competitive upbringing. Only now it was directed outward, toward a nation, rather than toward siblings. The house seemed to respond to this energy, embracing the shift from personal to public ambition, as naturally as it had once embraced the sounds of childhood. Bedrooms, too, acquired new identities. One room became a temporary press workspace, where reporters typed late into the night. Another held stacks of brochures and pamphlets waiting to be distributed. Even the quieter rooms, those that carried heavier emotional weight, began to adjust. They remained respectful of the past, but their silence no longer dominated the house. The influx of activity softened the stillness, weaving new purpose into the architecture without erasing the memories that lived there. The porch, a familiar gathering place since the earliest summers, now served as a stage. Journalists waited there for interviews, neighbors stopped by to offer support, and political allies used it as a place to strategize while watching the ocean stretch toward the horizon. The view, once a backdrop for family photographs, became part of the imagery presented to the country, a symbol of calm, stability, and heritage. The dock experienced its own transformation. Instead of being a launch point solely for sailboats, it became a place where photographers captured images of the family, projecting unity and strength. Each photo taken there, framed by the Atlantic, contributed to the narrative that Hyannis Port was not merely a residence, but a powerful emblem of leadership. As the campaign intensified, the compound's pace accelerated. Cars came and went at all hours. Advisors paced the lawn, with telephones pressed to their ears, the cords stretching as they tried to catch a better signal near the water. The garden paths carried footprints not just of family members, but of strategists, volunteers, and visitors whose names would later appear in history books. The estate, once a private sanctuary, now operated as a living, breathing hub of political life. Through all of this, Hyannis Port retained its familiar foundation. The rooms still smelled of salt air, the wind still bent the grass in the same direction, and the view from the windows remained constant. Yet the house had taken on the role for which its architecture had unintentionally prepared it. The competitive energy cultivated during childhood now powered the campaign's urgency. The closeness that once created rivalry now supported collaboration. The compound's layout, once designed for family cohesion, now offered the ideal structure for strategic communication. By the time national attention fully converged on the family, Hyannis Port had become more than a home and more than a symbol. It had become a center of influence, a summer headquarters where decisions echoed across the country. The estate that once shaped children into competitors had evolved into a space that shaped a candidate into a leader. And as the campaign advanced, the house prepared itself for its next role, the unofficial summer seat of American political power, the place where the family would stand before cameras and address a nation looking toward them for direction. Hyannis Port was alive again, louder, busier, and more purposeful than ever, embracing its transformation with the same momentum that had once defined the family who grew within its walls. The compound entered an entirely new phase the moment national leadership shifted onto the family's shoulders. What had once been merely a political base now took on the unmistakable shape of a presidential outpost. Hyannis Port, with its white clapboard houses and wide Atlantic views, began absorbing the infrastructure of state power, as if it had always been waiting for this transformation. The modifications were swift, purposeful, and exact, reshaping the familiar landscape into something both elevated and increasingly rigid. The first signs appeared on the lawn, where the quiet grass that had once hosted childhood games was carefully leveled and reinforced to accommodate a helicopter landing pad. The blades of grass flattened under the weight of machinery that arrived with military precision. Markers were set, clearances calculated. From the porch, the sound of rotor blades became a new kind of summer wind, carving patterns through the air that echoed far beyond the Cape. The neighbors felt the shift as much as the family did. The estate no longer belonged solely to itself. Security arrived next, not quietly, but with a structure that altered the estate's entire rhythm. Secret Service vehicles lined the road that had once welcomed neighbors and summer guests. Checkpoints appeared along the driveway, merging into the architecture with an efficiency that left no room for improvisation. Windows were reinforced. Guards patrolled the perimeter at all hours. Even the shoreline, once open to local fishermen drifting nearby, was monitored by small boats whose engines hummed steadily across the water. Every entrance became a boundary. Every boundary carried the weight of responsibility. Inside, the transformation was even more profound. A dedicated communications center was installed, where a sitting room used to be, filled with equipment that connected the summer residents directly to Washington. Cables ran along floorboards once reserved for children's feet. Telephones multiplied again, but now they carried voices from embassies, military advisors, and cabinet members. Operators rotated through the rooms in shifts, ensuring that no message, urgent or mundane, was ever delayed. In the evenings, lights from the equipment glowed behind partially closed doors, casting long geometric reflections across the wooden hallways. Press operations soon followed. A section of the house closest to the entrance was converted into a temporary press room where reporters could work while awaiting briefings. Desks were arranged in rows, typewriters replacing the old summer furniture. Microphones and cameras found permanent homes along the porch railings, pointed toward the spot where the president often stood to make statements framed by the ocean behind him. Photographers memorized the angles that best captured the compound's understated elegance, turning it into a symbol of national optimism. The surrounding houses in the compound also shifted in purpose. One became an auxiliary office for senior advisors, its rooms filled with maps, legislative drafts, and thick folders bound with ribbons. Another served as a staging area for security, where agents rotated in and out with disciplined efficiency. Even the pathways between buildings grew busier, as aides hurried across them with updates that could not wait for formal meetings. The estate, once simply a family retreat, now pulsed like a complex organism with its own heartbeat. And yet, beneath the productive hum of activity, the fabric of daily life inside the compound grew heavier. The walls that had once echoed with carefree laughter now absorbed the strain carried in private conversations. The porch, captured so often in cheerful photographs, became a place where fatigue pressed quietly against the edges of every moment. Late nights replaced the long morning sails that had once been the highlight of summer, files stacked in corners where sun hats used to lie. The shift was subtle at first, noticeable only to those who had known the place before, but the undertone deepened over time. Tension seeped into rooms that had previously been filled with warmth. Discussions behind closed doors grew sharper, faster, more urgent. Decisions carried weight that lingered even after conversations ended. Advisors walked the halls with tired eyes, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpets, but their worry unmistakable. Family members, too, felt the pressure. The estate's comforting familiarity could not fully shield them from the magnitude of national responsibilities pressing inward through every reinforced window. Even the ocean outside seemed to reflect the change. Where once the horizon had offered a sense of openness and ease, it now felt like a vast backdrop against which every decision was measured. Sailing trips became shorter, more supervised. Journalists turned even these brief escapes into symbols of leadership, capturing the president poised on the deck as though the water itself demanded guidance. The idea of rest became something the estate could no longer genuinely offer. As summer progressed, the contrast between the public image of Hyannis Port and the private reality inside its walls grew unmistakable. Photographs showed ease, elegance, and optimism. The family projected unity and energy. Yet behind those polished scenes lay the quieter moments of exhaustion, hands pressed to foreheads during late-night calls, silent walks along the beach long after everyone else had gone to sleep. The brief tension in a smile held for cameras just seconds before turning away. Hyannis Port had reached the height of its national importance. It was a center of decision-making, a symbol of vitality, a place where the country imagined its leadership at peace. But in that very fullness, the house carried the first hints of something more fragile, the pressure that tightened every day, the complex undercurrent that could not be photographed, and the faint tremor of an ending no one yet fully sensed, even as it settled quietly into the corners of the rooms. The compound stood brilliant and commanding, the pinnacle of its significance, yet already its walls were learning to brace for what would come next. The transformation happened with a brutality so swift that the house itself seemed to hold its breath. One day, Hyannis Port functioned as an extension of national leadership, phones active, advisors pacing the porch, reporters waiting by the gate. And the next, everything inside it shifted as though someone had cut a wire deep within its foundations. The soundscape that had become familiar during the height of its prominence vanished almost instantly. Telephones that normally rang without pause fell silent. The constant movement of security agents slowed into stillness. Even the machinery of communication, usually humming behind closed doors, seemed to fade into the background. The estate had experienced tension before, but this was different. This was the kind of silence that arrives only when the air itself understands something irreversible has taken place. News traveled quickly, carried first by television broadcasts that flickered in the early afternoon light. Staff gathered around screens, unable to move, watching unclear reports shift into horrifying clarity. The estate, designed for gatherings and movement, held clusters of people frozen in place. Outside, the flag that had flown proudly through summers of optimism began its slow descent toward half-mast, its fabric catching the wind in a way that felt unfamiliar, as though it too understood the weight of the moment. Family members arrived over the next hours, their steps heavy as they crossed the porch that had been photographed countless times as a symbol of youth and hope. Now that same porch absorbed grief in silence. The main living room, once filled with voices and planning sessions, became the place where the family gathered without speaking, each person sitting with their thoughts while rain tapped lightly against the windows. The house that had amplified every sound of life now muffled everything, as if trying to protect those inside from the immensity of what had happened. Security procedures remained intact, but even the agents moved with a new solemnity. Their radios, usually crackling with updates, whispered instead. Their presence felt less like protection and more like an acknowledgement that the estate had suddenly become a site of national mourning. The helicopter pad remained untouched, an open circle of flattened grass that now looked out of place, a symbol of an activity that would no longer resume. Inside the president's room, the change was most profound. What had been a working space filled with documents, briefing notes, and personal items arranged for convenience now became unbearably still. The books remained exactly where he had left them. The chair angled toward the window still faced the ocean. Pens lay uncapped on the desk beside a stack of papers he intended to review. The room felt suspended in time, a place waiting for someone who would never return. Family members entered quietly, one at a time, some barely crossing the threshold before stepping back out again, overwhelmed by the sudden transformation of a lived-in space into a space of remembrance. The corridors of the house, long accustomed to steady activity, now felt elongated and hollow. Footsteps echoed differently, carrying a weight they hadn't before. Even the children's voices, usually loud enough to fill every corner, were subdued. They sensed the shift without understanding its full magnitude, moving more slowly, staying closer to adults, instinctively recognizing that the estate was experiencing something deeper than sorrow. The ocean outside continued its steady rhythm, waves breaking softly against the shore, but even that familiar sound seemed muted. The horizon, once a symbol of freedom and continuity, now felt like a boundary, an edge beyond which something essential had slipped away. Neighbors who had celebrated the family's presence on the Cape now approached the property with quiet respect, leaving flowers near the gates or stopping at the church where candles glowed in the darkened sanctuary. Over the following days, Hyannis Port received visitors who came not for briefings or strategy, but to offer condolences. The rooms filled with low voices and embraces that lingered longer than usual. The walls, which had once absorbed political discussions and summer laughter, now carried the imprint of shared grief. At times, the estate seemed to retreat inward, as if trying to shelter itself from the outside world, holding memories close while resisting the intrusion of any noise that might distract from the overwhelming stillness. When the family left for the capital to take part in the national farewell, the house remained behind in a state of quiet suspension. For the first time in its history, Hyannis Port felt empty, not because people were absent, but because the energy that once defined it had been extinguished. Upon their return, nothing had changed. The silence persisted. The spaces that once echoed with ambition and vitality now served a new purpose. They preserved memories, carried unspoken questions, and held an ache that no rearrangement of furniture could dispel. The estate never regained the rhythm it had before. Even in later summers, when children returned to play and the family gathered again, something essential had shifted at its core. The laughter never rang quite as brightly. The porch never carried the same sense of possibility. The house remained beautiful, lived in and loved, but it carried an invisible weight, a reminder etched into its architecture that one day in Dallas had redirected the destiny of not just a family, but the home that had symbolized their ascent. Hyannis Port, once the stage of triumph and optimism, became a place of remembrance. The estate continued to stand strong against the Atlantic winds, but its meaning had changed forever. It was no longer a symbol of unshakable momentum. It had become the quiet heart of a story, marked by loss, an echo of a moment when everything stopped. Hickory Hill emerged in the family's story, almost as an act of quiet rebellion, a space that refused to mirror the solemnity and structure that had defined the other two estates. Where Hyannis Port carried the weight of legacy and Palm Beach embodied formality, Hickory Hill was built on noise, movement, and deliberate disorder. Its long hallways, wide lawns, and rambling rooms became home to a different rhythm, one shaped by Robert Kennedy's desire to build a sanctuary, untouched by the echoes that haunted the northern and southern residences. From the moment the family settled in, the house came alive with a kind of energy that disregarded traditional expectations. There was no carefully orchestrated competition here, no rigid schedules, no controlled displays of elegance. Instead, the estate pulsed with the sounds of children, dozens of them across the years, running through rooms, chasing each other across the expansive grounds, and filling the air with laughter that trailed behind them like bright strands of color. Animals added their own tone to the house's unique symphony. Dogs racing down hallways, a horse wandering too close to the back terrace, and an ever-changing collection of smaller creatures that somehow found their way into the family's orbit. The interior reflected this atmosphere with unapologetic honesty. Toys spilled across floors where polished wood had once been the focus. Walls carried the marks of children's adventures. Books, sports equipment, and half-finished school projects shared space on tables. Every room seemed to open not to formality, but to the vitality of life lived at full volume. It was a deliberate contrast, a world designed not to perform, but simply to breathe. Robert embraced this environment as both refuge and declaration. He had grown up in houses shaped by ambition and controlled by expectation, where silence often held more meaning than words, and where even play carried the weight of parental scrutiny. In Hickory Hill, he carved out a different definition of home, one where affection was abundant, noise was welcomed, and the boundaries between indoor and outdoor life were porous. He moved through the house with ease, followed by children clutching at his sleeves, animals trailing behind, and advisors stepping awkwardly around toys to deliver updates. Even political discussions, when they took place here, felt softened by the backdrop of family chaos. But beneath the noise lay an unspoken purpose. The house's disorder, however natural it appeared, was also a shield. For a family marked repeatedly by painful turns of fate, Hickory Hill became an attempt to drown out the quiet that had settled over the other estates, especially the quiet that followed every message of loss. Robert seemed determined to build a place where silence would never again have the power to suffocate. The laughter of his children, the unpredictable movements of animals, the constant footfalls. These were his way of keeping the shadows at bay. Yet even within this bright disorder, the undercurrents of the family's story found their way in. Visitors who came for meetings could sense moments when the mood shifted, when Robert's expression tightened during a phone call, or when the house slowed briefly after receiving news from afar. For all its noise, Hickory Hill was not immune to the weight carried by its owner. The walls had begun to absorb not only the sound of play, but also the tension of decisions being made in late-night conversations, the kind that demanded more than the house's signature chaos could hide. As political responsibility deepened, the estate slowly became another node in the family's larger network of influence. The dining table, often crowded with children and neighbors, began hosting meetings that stretched long into the evening. Advisors walked from room to room, carrying folders thick with concerns that reached far beyond Virginia. Journalists took photographs of the family's exuberant life, unknowingly capturing the contrast between the joyful surface and the seriousness beneath it. Hickory Hill, though still informal, was now pulled into the orbit of a destiny that had shaped the other residences. The house began to hold traces of both brightness and heaviness. The corners where children whispered secrets remained untouched by the adult world, yet the hallways started to echo with steps taken by people who brought with them the complexities of national unrest. Even Robert, who thrived in the unfiltered emotion of the estate, could not fully separate his personal sanctuary from the growing demands outside its walls. His movements between rooms carried a weight that hinted at the widening gap between the life he created here and the responsibilities pressing toward him. As the years progressed, visitors noticed a subtle shift. The chaos that once felt purely joyful developed an edge, a sense that the noise was not only an expression of life, but also a defense against the heaviness gathering around the family again. The estate still radiated warmth, but certain moments felt stretched thin, as though the house itself sensed that it was being drawn into a pattern larger than its original purpose. Hickory Hill had been created to resist the fate that had settled over Hyannis Port and lingered in Palm Beach. It was a house built on movement rather than stillness, on abundance rather than restraint, on love rather than pressure. But as events beyond its doors intensified, it began absorbing the same invisible strain that had transformed the other houses. Even in a place filled with laughter, the approaching turbulence was becoming impossible to ignore. The estate stood vibrant and alive, but already quietly it had begun to brace itself for what would come. By the late 1960s, both Hyannis Port and Hickory Hill had settled into their distinct identities. One a place of memory, shaped by earlier loss, the other a refuge of noise built to keep darkness at a distance. Yet, as the year unfolded, both houses found themselves slowing under an invisible pressure, as though sensing a shift before it arrived. The air in each residence grew heavier, conversations shortened, and the everyday rhythm of movement took on a hesitancy that no one could properly explain. It was as if both estates, with all their differences, were holding their breath at the same time. Hyannis Port felt it first. The compound, emptied of presidential activity and now defined more by recollection than by ambition, seemed unusually still as the summer approached. Rooms that had once carried the urgency of national decisions now echoed with the soft, uncertain steps of family members who drifted through them, waiting for updates carried by telephones that rang too seldom and always with tension. The porch, once a stage for speeches and family portraits, became the place where people sat quietly, looking toward the water without really seeing it. The house, which had long served as the emotional anchor of the family, sensed something gathering on the horizon, something that could not be prevented. Hickory Hill felt the same shift, though it took a different form. The usual chaos of children racing across the lawn continued, but beneath the laughter ran a current of unease. Robert moved quickly from room to room, his energy sharp, his attention pulled constantly between campaign travel and the responsibilities of home. The estate tried to maintain its familiar noise, but moments of silence began appearing in unusual places. A pause before dinner, a sudden hush in the hallway, a lingering glance exchanged between adults when a phone rang at a strange hour. Even the animals seemed restless, pacing the grounds as though sensing the tension in the air. When the news finally came from Los Angeles, neither house had the ability to absorb it gently. The information struck both estates with a force that seemed to dim the light inside them. Hyannis Port received the first call in the early hours, delivered with a softness that could not disguise the weight of the message. Staff members gathered in the main living room, that familiar space now once again transformed into a room of waiting and grief. Family hurried to the house, moving through the hallways with the same disoriented steps that had followed the events in Dallas. The old silence returned, not the quiet of rest, but the one that wraps around a place when it is reminded of everything it has already lost. Hickory Hill learned the news almost simultaneously. The house that had fought so hard to stay loud suddenly fell still. Children were gathered away from the main rooms. Adults moved through the halls as though pulled by gravity, and phones rang repeatedly with calls from across the country. Advisors, neighbors, friends, everyone arrived with eyes lowered, unable to find words that could ease the shock. The estate that had always refused to succumb to the weight of grief could no longer hold back the tide. Silence settled over the lawns, over the kitchen where meals went untouched, over the staircase where children pressed close to their parents, sensing that something irreversible had happened. In the days that followed, Hickory Hill transformed once more. Cars lined the driveway, carrying officials, journalists, and friends of the family. Every room became a meeting place or a resting point for someone offering support. The dining table filled with flowers and notes from across the world. The controlled chaos that had once defined the house dissolved, replaced by a disorder shaped by sorrow. The estate moved not with laughter now, but with the soft footsteps of people comforting one another. It was in this atmosphere that Robert returned home, carried into the house he had filled with life, the house that had given him shelter from the past and space for hope. Hyannis Port changed in parallel. The living room once again became the central space for family gathering, its furniture rearranged to accommodate the constant arrival of relatives. The corridors that had once been filled with political energy and later with quiet contemplation now carried the soft sounds of people moving in and out, with tearful embraces and long, silent pauses. The compound's shoreline, familiar for its calm beauty, felt altered, its stillness now amplifying the heaviness in the house. The ocean kept its steady rhythm, but the people standing near it felt disconnected from its calm. As the ceremonies unfolded, one house held its final moments with Robert, while the other prepared to receive the family returning from yet another national farewell. Hickory Hill, with all its warmth and chaos, felt emptied in a way it had never experienced. Each room, still cluttered with signs of daily life, now carried a quietness that echoed too clearly. The estate that had tried to resist silence was overtaken by it. Hyannis Port, meanwhile, braced itself once more. The family gathered after the final service, returning to the house that had already borne too much. The rooms absorbed another wave of grief. The porch saw another generation of lowered heads. The lawn, once alive with games, watched as footsteps slowly crossed it on the way back from the water's edge. Both houses, so different in spirit, were now united by the same emptiness. Each one had tried to protect its inhabitants, one through structure, the other through chaos, but neither could outrun the pattern that had woven itself into the family's story. Hyannis Port stood solemn and heavy, Hickory Hill raw and shaken, yet both held the same truth. They could no longer keep pace with the lives that moved through them. The family had once built these spaces to support their rise. Now the houses had become the places where the weight of destiny settled, one loss after another, until even their walls seemed to understand that nothing would ever feel whole again. By the early 1970s, the three homes that once governed the rhythm of an entire family began to drift into a quieter era. Their architecture remained unchanged from a distance, white siding catching morning sun in Hyannis Port, Mediterranean lines glowing against the Florida heat in Palm Beach, and the sprawling lawn of Hickory Hill stretching toward the Virginia woods. But something fundamental within each of them had shifted. They no longer carried the weight of ambition or the noise of gatherings that once filled every corner. Instead, they absorbed the slow settling of time, like great ships anchored after a long voyage, their decks empty, their halls dim. Hyannis Port, the first of the three, grew older in a way that felt almost human. The main house, once the heart of political planning and family celebration, now moved at a slower pace. Paint faded under salt-heavy winds, and the porches that had held the weight of photographers and advisors now creaked softly as aging relatives stepped across them with measured movements. Rooms that had once held meetings late into the night waited quietly for someone to enter, their curtains unmoving, their surfaces gathering thin layers of dust between summer visits. The house still belonged to the family, but it had stopped being a forward-looking place. Instead, it became a ledger of memories, each doorway reminding visitors of moments no one dared to speak of too often. Palm Beach aged differently. The house, with its elegant arches and warm stucco walls, had always projected a formal confidence. But as years passed, its grandeur began to echo. Shutters closed more often than they opened. The courtyard, once filled with careful conversations and winter sunlight, grew quieter, its fountain running only occasionally, its stone paths warmed by the sun, yet untouched by footsteps. The estate no longer hosted the gatherings that once defined it. Instead, it became a retreat only in name, a place visited briefly, then left behind again, as though the family felt unable or unwilling to inhabit its bright spaces the way they once had. The women who remained in these houses carried their silence with resilience. They kept routines that offered a sense of order, moving through rooms that had witnessed the highest peaks and darkest shadows of the family's history. Their presence added a different kind of gravity, a gentle, steadying weight that softened the sharp edges of memory but never erased them. These were not places of strategy anymore. They were sanctuaries where time passed more slowly, reminding those who stayed of everything the walls had witnessed. Hickory Hill changed as well, though in a way that felt almost contradictory to its past. The house that once vibrated with the movement of children and animals grew still. The open lawn quieted. The corridors that had been filled with shouts and laughter now held only the occasional echo of someone walking from room to room. Toys remained stored in bins, untouched. Photographs stayed where they had always been, their frames collecting dust as seasons passed outside the windows. The house held on to its past with a tenderness that made its stillness even more striking. It had tried so hard to resist silence, but in the end, it accepted it with a subdued grace. Over time, each estate began drifting into its final identity. Hyannis Port became a place people spoke of in lowered tones, as if raising their voice might disturb what lay inside. Visitors walked its grounds slowly, aware that the house belonged not just to the family, but to the larger story of a nation. Palm Beach, too, evolved into an elegant but distant reminder of a world that had slipped into history. Its rooms were kept clean, its gardens tended, yet no one mistook it for an active home. It had become a symbol rather than a residence. Hickory Hill followed a similar path. Though younger than the other two, it aged quickly under the weight of memory. The brightness it once held dimmed, and the house seemed to exhale, allowing its history to settle into its foundations. People came less frequently, staying shorter amounts of time, leaving earlier than planned. Even those who had grown up within its walls sensed that the house no longer belonged to life as it once did. It belonged to the story. By the late 20th century, the homes had fully transitioned from active centers of family life to monuments in their own right. Hyannis Port, with its modest architecture shaped by decades of emotion, became a kind of living memorial. Visitors felt a quiet reverence as they stepped onto the porch, the air carrying a faint echo of voices long gone. The house no longer needed activity to give it meaning. It had become a place where memory itself lived. Hickory Hill became something different, a private shrine to joy and loss intertwined. Its grounds held the imprint of childhoods, while its interior held the weight of what followed. Few family members returned often, but when they did, they walked the rooms as though revisiting a dream they were unsure they wanted to remember in full. Palm Beach became the most distant of the three, a house that seemed to float somewhere between the world of the living and the world of myth. It remained beautiful, but almost too polished, as if preserved in a way that made it unreal. Time touched it gently, but even that softness reminded visitors that the estate no longer belonged to the present. Eventually, all three houses transformed from homes into symbols. Hyannis Port became the backdrop of documentaries, its image instantly recognizable. Hickory Hill became a place spoken of in past tense, its legend kept alive through stories rather than visits. Palm Beach faded into the realm of whispered memory, known but seldom approached. What survives in these places is not just architecture or history, but the quiet held between the walls, the unspoken moments, the echoes of footsteps, the remnants of laughter, the weight of everything that once happened inside them. These homes remember more than any biography could hold. They remember the individuals who passed through them, the hopes that rose and fell, the shadows that settled, and the light that briefly but brilliantly filled every room. In their silence, they tell a story larger than a family, the story of ambition, loss, and the fragile line between legacy and myth. They stand not as symbols of power, but as the last custodians of memories that no longer have voices. And in their stillness, they continue to carry the names of those who shaped them, quietly repeating them through the halls where life once moved with unstoppable force.